right, well, today we're going to finish up this series on politics. And it's interesting that it falls on this day of Transfiguration. So we had the story of Moses and what he looked like after his encounter with the Lord. Let's hear these words of an encounter that Jesus and some of his friends had. About 8 days after Jesus said these things, he took Peter, John, and James and went up on a mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes flashed white like lightning. 2 men, Moses and Elijah, were talking with him. They were clothed with heavenly splendor and spoke about Jesus' departure, which he would achieve in Jerusalem. Peter and those with him were almost overcome by sleep, but they managed to stay awake and saw his glory as well as the 2 men with him. As the 2 men were about to leave Jesus, Peter said to him, "Master, it's good that we're here. We should construct 3 shrines for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." But Peter didn't know what he was saying. Peter was still speaking when a cloud overshadowed them, and as they entered the cloud, they were overcome with awe. Then a voice from the cloud said, "This is my Son, my chosen one. Listen to him." Even as the voice spoke, Jesus was found alone. They were speechless, and at the time told no one what they had seen. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Diana Butler Bass, in a book I've been using these last few weeks called Broken We Kneel, tells the story of Saint Martin of Tours. Some of you may be familiar with it. Martin was born in the 4th century, not long after Constantine converted the whole of the Roman Empire to the Christian faith. And his parents were pagans, but at a young age, Martin was converted to Christ. He became consumed with his love of Christ. Unfortunately, his parents didn't feel the same, and while Christians at that time were still very much pacifists and were not inclined to join the military, Martin's father made sure that he did. So Martin became a soldier. One day, he was probably riding along. He was part of a cavalry unit. He saw a beggar, and he took off his military cloak. He took his sword, and he cut the cloak in half and gave half of his cloak to the beggar at the side of the road. Later on, he had a dream in which he saw clearly Jesus in his dream wearing that cloak and saying that Martin, who hasn't even been baptized yet, covered me with his cloak. Well, that became a miraculous event, and that cloak became a relic of the church, and in time, Martin became a bishop and now is a saint. That cape, or one like it, was taken by French kings. A structure was built for it, and it was carried to the scene of battle when they went to war as something to help them to win victory. And there were priests who were assigned to be with that structure when they took it to battle. They came to be called chaplains, because the little structure came to be called a chapel from cape. Diana Butler Bass talks about the difference between chapels and church. That chapel is something that is about finding victory for us. It is about finding comfort in times of crisis. Chapel is an optional thing. It's something you go to when you need it. It's a low-demand place of faith. Chapel is all about controlling disorder. It's about finding comfort in times of chaos. It makes religion something that conforms to our needs of it. And Bass wants to draw a distinction between that and church. That church is about transformation. Church is a high demand attendance. That God changes people through church, through that compassionate hospitality of love that is offered through a people, not a structure. Chapel is a place for civic piety. Chapel is a place, Bass says, that people flocked to after 9/11. When people in the church thought, wow, we have finally had a revival, people are now coming back to church, but within 6 or 8 weeks, the numbers were back to where they were. The personal need for that place of comfort had passed. The personal need for a place of transformation had not taken hold. But Bass also tells the story of a different chapel. She tells the story of St. Paul's Chapel. Some of you will remember this from those days after 9/11 in 2001. She said when she was doing some research, she, in 1998, had gone to New York City and had found one of the women that she was researching had buried her children, her infant children, at St. Paul's Chapel. And so Bass went to see St. Paul's Chapel, which is right across the street. Donna, if you could hit the next slide. It's right across the street from the site of the World Trade Center. That's it, up there on the left. World Trade Center site is the big square there, and St. Paul's Chapel is right across the street. So she went to St. Paul's Chapel, and it was all locked up, big iron gates locked up when she got there. Nobody was there. As a matter of fact, Trinity Church on Wall Street owned that chapel. St. Paul's Chapel was built way back when. It's the oldest standing chapel, church building in Manhattan. It was built way back in 1766. It was a place where George Washington went to worship after he was made president. It was a chapel of ease. It was built down closer to some of the people because the schlep up to the larger church in Upper Manhattan was a little too far for some folks. Again, it was a chapel. It was made to fit the needs of the people, the comfort of the people. But at this point, in 1998, the chapel was almost always empty. She had to go to Trinity Church to get the verger there to come down and unlock it so she could go in and look around. She found inside a display that was looking back on the George Washington's becoming president with the title of the display, "It is done." And she thought, what a fitting phrase for this church. The phrase that Jesus spoke from the cross, "It is finished." Clearly, this church is finished. Until 9/11, 2001, when the towers fell, miraculously St. Paul's Chapel was not damaged. And St. Paul's Chapel was no longer done. It found new life. For the 8 months after 9/11, St. Paul's Chapel became a haven for the firefighters and the police and the recovery personnel and the construction workers who were across the street. People would come across the street from the site of the destruction, and they would find prayer. They would find counseling. They would find meals and music. They would find back massages at lunchtime. They found a foot clinic. And the place filled up with banners. Go to the next slide, Donna. The place filled up with banners and cards and well wishes from around the country and around the world. You can see where they're hanging everywhere. The place changed. It was no longer a chapel of ease. It became a place rocking with love and compassion. Some quotes from some people. One volunteer who worked there named Jan, she said, "I saw the church in a whole new light this week. I'm a cradle Episcopalian and have never seen the church be anything but a pristine house of worship, as I had always envisioned it to be. But this week at St. Paul's Chapel, I saw the church in its most beautiful form, as a sanctuary for those in need, as a home, not just a house of God. The walls, pillars, doors all exclaim God's love and the wonder of people throughout the world whose faith is strong in the face of such horror. It was awe-inspiring. It changed me, and it changed my definition of a church." One of the staff members at Trinity Church served hundreds of hours at St. Paul's, and he found the meaning of 9/11 there. He said, "At St. Paul's, I found a community of compassion where all the people who came there had in some way experienced radical vulnerability on September 11th, and were coming with a purpose, to be compassionate, to be there for others in need. It was a foretaste of the kingdom. Out of this tragedy, the kind of personal transformation can take place that ultimately can be a kernel out of which some real transformation of human relations can take place across the globe." This chapel of ease had been transformed into a mission outpost of the church. Parker Palmer, the Quaker thinker, writer, teacher, talks about heart. Some of you may remember Robert Bella's work back a quarter of a century ago now, called Habits of the Heart. Palmer takes this on a few years ago, looking at politics and democracy in our country. He says, heart is important for us to know because heart points to a larger way of knowing than just intellectual, emotional, our imagination, our intuition. It pulls all of those things together. Our heart is where we find the courage to act on what we know in all those different ways in our life. He says if we encounter life wholeheartedly, if we encounter life with our whole self, with our whole being, it stands to reason that occasionally that heart is going to be broken by this world. Whether it's loss or failure or defeat or betrayal or death, we experience heartbreak. But he says what is key and what is crucial is what happens after that breaking. It depends on how the heart breaks. He says if the heart breaks apart, if it breaks apart into tens or hundreds or thousands of little pieces, the result is probably going to be anger and depression and disengagement. The heart is defeated if it is broken apart in that way. But things are different if the heart is not broken apart into little pieces, but is rather broken open. If the heart is broken open, there is a greater capacity created to hold the complexities and the contradictions of life. If the heart is broken open rather than broken apart, it may find itself energized and expanded, its capacity grown. The heart is what makes us human, and politics is a profoundly human enterprise, isn't it? It's what polis, the root, is about, people. So, whose hands politics is in says a lot and determines a lot about how this world looks. If politics is in the hands of those whose hearts have been broken open rather than apart, politics can actually help us to hold our differences creatively and to use our power courageously for the sake of a more just and compassionate world. St. Paul's Chapel and the people who found themselves in it, their hearts were broken open by 9/11. A time when we would expect perhaps that our hearts would be broken apart. And in many ways, in many times and places after 9/11, hearts were broken apart and we felt defeated and broken and angry and depressed. But there were pockets. Amid all the chapel going in the country during that time, there were pockets of church. Michael Ware wrote an article that was in The Atlantic a couple of years ago, talking about how a new sort of Christian is emerging. Remember last week I mentioned that progression over the last several decades, especially of the religious right. After the religious left did its work during the civil rights era, the religious right had its time, looking for political influence and power, and through the 80s and 90s, tried to garner a lot of it. But that left the millennial generation resentful and turned off and turned away from faith and from the church. So things have changed. Ware wants us to observe that a new sort of Christian is emerging following that stark disillusionment of those days. And these new Christian leaders in the evangelical and progressive wings of the church are seeking influence, but their ultimate commitment is not to power, but to faithfulness. He says they have political preferences, but they're willing to work with anyone, and they're willing to disagree with anyone. They are able to hold those two things in tension with each other. There are strong voices across the spectrum of religious leaders. For example, talking about the immigration issue. You've seen it in the last 6 months. Politicians have been a little bit befuddled that there has been consensus among Christians on the left and the right about this immigration issue and where we stand in terms of hospitality and welcome and compassion for those who are in need of it. One politician said he was going to have to go home and talk to his people about it because they clearly weren't on board. Christians, these younger Christians, these millennial and Gen X Christians, have a desire to be known for what they are for, rather than for what they are stridently opposed to. It's like in the passage from Corinthians that Denise read for us today. Paul says, "We commend ourselves to everyone's conscience in the sight of God by the public announcement of the truth." That's what these new emerging political Christians are about. One of the test cases for this new way of being politically active is Pope Francis. The question is, can Christians thrive in the public square while continuing to hold to basic principles and Christian beliefs? For example, Pope Francis, he's a new kind of pope, right? We've enjoyed watching him over these last couple of years. He washes the feet of Muslim girls. Rather than leaping to judge gay or straight sexuality, he starts from a place of humility. He sneaks out of the Vatican at night to serve the poor. And yet, Francis has been consistent with traditional Catholic teachings and doctrines on homosexuality and women in leadership and reproductive issues. So that question is out there. Is it possible to hold to strong principles while still being able to prefer partnership to polarization and to prefer conversation to condemnation? In 2013, some of you may be Duck Dynasty fans. You may remember Phil Robertson from that show, who said some pretty offensive things about homosexuality based on his faith, his Christian faith. And there were voices that said, oh, you need to fire him, get him off the TV, all of that. But there were also voices across the political and religious spectrum that responded differently to the situation. There were voices that wanted to use it not as a chance to shut things down, but as an opportunity to engage with the ideas that Robertson put out there. Not letting those things become an incitement to violence and attacks and conflict, but a way to talk together. Rather than shutting down conversation, have it be an opportunity to lift it up. So this new way of being Christian and political is really a return to the basics. It's a return to Jesus and to people. It's about reaching for a new equilibrium. It's a both and faith. It's a faith that is passionate about the prophetic and the pastoral. It's a faith that is passionate about mercy and justice. It's a faith that is wanting to stretch and aspire to holiness, and at the same time welcoming the free gift of grace. And so there are two questions. One question that Christians for a while have been asking is, how do I win? How do I get my way of looking at the world and my understanding of God's way of looking at the world to be the way everyone looks at the world? But Ware says that may not be the question anymore. The question is not, how do I win anymore? The question is, how can we live together? Parker Palmer has 5 habits of the heart. Donna, go. One more. First one, to recognize that we are all in this together, that we are interconnected, that we are dependent on each other, that there's no way to avoid that the idea that we can live without one another is a myth, it's a falsehood. Which leads to number 2, the value of otherness. Once we recognize that we are interconnected, that we are dependent on one another, that means we have to value those who are different from us. There's no longer us versus them, it is us and them. So then that leads us to number 3, which is the ability to hold tensions together in life-giving ways. This is about that being broken open rather than being broken apart. That we begin to have new understandings of ourselves and of the world. That respect, that appreciation of otherness, of those who are different from us, expand our capacity, expands our possibilities in our lives. Which leads to number 4. That we acquire a sense of personal voice and agency. Like Paul talks about there, about being bold and unapologetic. We figure out that we can make contributions to positive change. Once we understand ourselves better, once we understand the contradictions of life, the tensions in life, we can understand ourselves better. One of the ways Charlotte and I have talked about this now and then is thinking about how it is we relate to people of other faiths. We don't have to be apologetic for our faith. We don't have to be scared of theirs. We just be transparent and honest and authentic about what it is we know. And we share that with the world. And finally, that sharing leads to number 5, a capacity to create community. Because once we have that personal sense of ourself and our agency and that we need to let our voice be heard in the world, we need some folks to have our back. That's what it means to be community. And when communities begin to join their voices together, extraordinary things can happen. And it becomes much less likely. Remember last week we talked about how it's so easy for Christians, and we have done it so often through the years, it's so easy for us to lean over into the world's way of doing things that we can fall in. Well, if there's somebody behind you holding on to your belt loop, you can't fall in. That's what community is for. That's what being a part of the body is about, having that support as we go forward. So, Christians are people whose hearts are broken open by the needs of the world. We find ourselves energized by the power of a resurrected, risen Christ, who promises that there is more to our lives than simply propping people up in this earthly city. This is what the disciples found on that mountaintop with Jesus when they said, hey, look, we'll build you some shrines, we'll build you some stalls to live in. And the passage says, Peter didn't know what he was saying. So often we want to build chapels. We want to build places that make us feel comfortable. That idea was not about making Jesus and Moses and Elijah comfortable. That was about making Peter and James and John feel comfortable with the situation. That is chapel religion. That is not church faith. We are to be a people of church faith, transforming us into something different, into people who recognize the world's ways as opposed to Christ's ways. We are called by Christ to be church to the world, to show the world who it is as opposed to who we are. Boldly, unapologetically, we are to be a witness. We are to expose the inadequate politics of independents and Democrats and Republicans, because their politics are less than the world needs. They're always inadequate. They always fall short. We are to show the world what a politics of the heart looks like. A politics of connection, where relationship is always first. Relationship is always primary. Relationship always comes before results. It's a politics for which Christ's body was broken by the powers that be, that he might rise and shine and call us to see and know the world as he sees it, that we might live into that world, a world that is desperately in need of love and forgiveness and peace. Might we be a people of peace. Amen.